trap cropping, would downy mildew goes on more, well, I guess you could say they were on covered squash. But the concept of planting earlier cucurbits for protecting other squash would work the same as for protecting cucumbers. So you planted your trap plants like 2 weeks earlier than your cucumbers. And I was just wondering, you're going to answer my question by thinking about it, but you can plant, if your main crop is another cucurbit, and you planted a cucurbit 2 weeks earlier than your main crop, that would pretty much do the same thing as far as protecting from downy mildew from there we go. Got it all mixed up. That, no wonder why you were looking at it.
I think it would depend.
Can you rephrase the question?
I think the question was if you just plant some plants earlier than others, is it going to be a trap crop?
Yeah, regardless of whether you're trying to protect cucumbers or whether you're trying to protect zucchini.
I think it would really depend on whether it's genotypically more attractive than what you're planting as a main crop, and also would depend on whether it's flowering earlier. So I don't think you just put plants out earlier and assume that they'll be the trap crop, because if you get them out early enough, the beetles haven't even showed up. Does that answer?
Downy mildew question. We've had the same experience, of course, as everybody's had with downy mildew on cucumbers coming off and getting worse, and on netted melons. Last year, for the first time, certain varieties of winter squash were decimated. And when you walk down the road, it would be one variety and not the next variety. Just like the cucumbers, just turned brown in one day, and then the patch right next to it is perfect. A different variety of winter squash. This is the first time we've ever seen it on winter squash. Has there been any other instance of that, or has it heard anything about it?
Yeah, so the question was, he's noticed some downy mildew, some pretty severe symptoms of downy mildew on winter squash. Has there been any other cases of that? The answer is yes. We're finding that this new strain of downy mildew is taking its toll on cucurbits across the board. So we're finding this in cucumbers and melons, in squash. It doesn't, the symptoms don't seem to be as severe or to appear as quickly in squash, at least from what I've seen as they do in cucumbers, although it sounds like in your fields it is that severe. But we're actually beginning work on developing the resistance in winter squash and melons, provided we get funding for those projects.
How many of you grow cucurbits and had downy mildew in the last 3 years? Okay, so real significant number. Other questions?
I was just wondering, inside the high tunnels, when you saw the bacterial wilt, were there beetles present, or?
The question was, were there beetles present in the high tunnels when we saw the wilt? There were. Bacterial wilt is only vectored by beetles, so whether we see them or not, they're there. And the high tunnels do seem to prevent insects from entering more than in the open field. I mean, we've seen that in a number of insects. Japanese beetles for one, cucumber beetles are another. But even if there's just a few, they can really vector the disease really quickly.
We've done trials, you can exclude them really easily if you're willing to take a little bit of heat game in your high tunnel for a while, which would be mid-June through mid-July.
How did you do that?
Actually, we worked with Zaid Cordell over at Norwich Meadow Farms. He's a high tunnel organic grower that exports to New York City by and large, and he just put screens up on the sides of his and the fronts to maintain pretty good exclusion. You do sacrifice a little bit of control over the environment that way, though. It does warm up a bit more, but it's easy to do.
Other questions for our panel? Yes?
bacterial wilt? Because, I know that was mentioned with the high tunnel issue. And, I was struck by your comment that squash generally outgrows early season cucumber beetle damage, which is completely opposite from what we're finding in Rhode Island, which is it gets bacterial wilt and it collapses. And I'm wondering if maybe some of that could be linked to humidity differences and whether there was any research on that.
I don't know.
Okay.
I have one observation on the high tunnel cucumber things. We last year planted highly trellised cucumbers into the tops of high tunnel, and started to see wilt of alternate plants or plants here and there. And I was reading something from California about transpiration, and that when you spread these things out in a high tunnel, they require so much more water than they do if they're on the ground or lowly trellis, and then try increasing the irrigation. So we doubled and then tripled the irrigation, and the wilt went away. The plants recovered, but now this was, at this point, a huge amount of water. We were, maybe an impractical amount of water that we were pouring into these plants, but it wasn't bacterial wilt, because it would not go away.
They find the same thing on like trees that are, you have phytophthora, the only thing they can do is treat them really well to get them through it. I also question whether this is what you've seen in the wilt in the high tunnels is really bacterial wilt a lot of times, because people have told me that they got serious bacterial wilt problems, but it's appearing before the beetles are ever really ramping up something. Well, you might have something else, especially if you're drip irrigating and it's moist under there. You ought to be consulting somebody who's a little bit proficient with soil pathology and looking to see if it's something besides bacterial wilt. Bacterial wilt should be fairly easy to diagnose too.
Good research project for Cornell.
I would add to that though. I would not rule out bacterial wilt because given enough water, plants can not necessarily outgrow bacterial wilt because the bacteria will still be there, but they'll have enough water where that water can bypass those clots in the xylem and they can transpire still. So in cucumbers anyway, there's not, besides just having a lack of water, there's not many other diseases that will cause the wilting that's characteristic of bacterial wilt.
Brian, did you have a question?
I was at one point I was wondering whether there were any of the wild squash bees in any of those fields where you introduced the bumblebees.
Yeah, so the question was whether or not there are any squash bees in the fields where we put managed bees. Yeah, there were, and in some fields there were a lot, and in other fields there were hardly any. So we're curious to know what factors are affecting the squash bees. Whether or not it's this history of cucurbit production, which is that's what I would suspect is increasing squash bee population. One of the growers we work with for the past 10 years has grown about 60 acres of pumpkins in the same general area, and he had hundreds upon hundreds of squash bees.
But they were still not able to fully pollinate the crop, it sounds like.
Right. My advisor, Brian Meld's previous work has shown that they're just not very good pollinators.
Well, related to that, I was curious. I mean, you said you were sure that supplementing the honeybees, well, you're not sure, but you thought there was a definite trend. But then you put the slides up comparing honeybee visits and didn't really talk much about the fact that they were fewer in the supplemented. Do you think that's because that wasn't a good indicator of their activity? What was the timing for? Or if not, why? What explains the increase?
In yield? Yeah, so the question was because we saw a trend towards fewer bumblebees in bumblebee supplemented fields compared to non-supplemented fields, but we saw an increase in yield in bumblebee supplemented fields. We're not sure. It could be that we're not, that our survey methods aren't catching them, perhaps, not catching the bumblebees as well. that's pretty much the only thing we can think of. And that's also why we're interested in adding more bumblebees, that perhaps just overwhelming the flowers with bumblebees. We just saw so few bumblebees. We looked. Yeah.
Abby?
Is the species that you're buying from Culver the same species that is out naturally, or it is the same species?
Yeah, the question was whether or not the bumblebees we buy from Covert is the same species that's
So
wild.
there's really only one wild species of bumblebees?
No, there's others, but that's the most common. It's Bombus impatiens, the combination bumblebee. Yeah, it's the same species.
I guess I asked that because I wondered if they were more aggressive in chasing everybody else out. Are they like bigger, better fed?
Yeah.
More robust than?
Yeah, so the question is whether or not the commercial bees are bigger and might be pushing others out. That could very well be. We would love to be able to find wild nests and do the same thing that we're going to do looking at the pollen going back to wild nests in the vicinity of pumpkin fields, but they're just really, really hard to find. So we're going to do it with the commercial hives and see what we get. But yeah, it's a really good question. And along those same lines, they might actually, our theory would be that the commercial bees are actually not necessarily as effective as the wild ones, primarily based on size. The commercial ones are slightly smaller than the wild ones and less acclimated to the area. Obviously, they're shifting from Michigan.
Other questions? Or other research questions that you have or you see as needs in cucurbitor crops, problems or challenges that you're facing?
I'm kind of curious how many people supplement with these if you grow cucurbits.
So let's say 3 or 4 people.
How many people might now be interested in supplementing with these?
I have a question for everyone too. So we heard about downy mildew and the winter squash. What were some other big disease problems that you had while growing cucurbits, whether in winter squash, summer squash, cucumbers, melons? No one had any disease?
No one had any
Well,
other disease problems.
One thing about winter squash is I think there's a wide spectrum of susceptibility to downy mildew in winter squash, I'm pretty sure, isn't that right? Meg, you're our downy mildew person.
There's differences between the acorn and the butternut squash, just because they differ in both haplotype. They're susceptible. The butternuts are definitely pretty severely affected. I don't know, Bill, do you know, has anyone really sat down and looked at the different winter squashes that closely? Like we have with cucumbers?
Yeah, I'm not sure. We're going to be delving into that more in the future, but I don't know what's been done so far.
And a follow-up to that is a similar one. Didn't somebody mention that there was bacterial wilt in their winter squash? Yeah, and again, I'm pretty sure that when I used to work with Extension, finding bacterial wilt in winter squash was quite a surprise. And there were only a few pumpkin varieties that were kind of new on the scene that were susceptible to bacterial wilt. And so I would assume, and we grew delicata squash in our trial at Cornell for several years, where they're just loaded with cucumber beetles. So, and they showed no signs whatsoever of bacterial wilt. So I'm pretty sure at least this delicata is resistant, and I think a lot of other winter squashes too. So.
But he's talking about resistance to
The bacterial wilt.
bacterial wilt, not.
What we're seeing at Rhode Island is that we grow a wide variety of squash and do a lot of variety trials, lots of different blends. There's definite differences in how badly they get hit. I don't know, basically because we haven't looked that closely, how much of it is related to attractiveness to the cucumber beetles as opposed to straight out susceptibility to the bacteria. We have a lot less trouble with butternut types. We have the worst trouble with maximatites. We basically had to give up on kabochas because we can't keep the wilt out of them, and what happens is we lose like 3/4 to 7/8 of the stand. So there are definitely some differences out there. I don't know, because I've only been at Rhode Island I've only been growing squash there for 3-4 years. The history, whether things have changed, in susceptibility. Maybe there's a difference in how much wilt, which overwinters in the gut of the beetles, is making it through the winter.
So I'm going to ask the growers again to sort of draw out some research interests or ideas from you, challenges that you're faced, anything you want to put on the table. Got a room full of people just itching to start, right?
The mildew
Yes.
and the cucumbers is the.
Mildew and cucumbers?
Our biggest challenge.
Anyone else have trouble with that?
10 years ago, it was a different problem.
Can I ask you what varieties you grow?
I've tried all kinds, the market boards, a lot of them.
So mildew and cucumbers? Other issues, challenges?
Downy or powdery?
Powdery mildew. Powdery mildew.
Well, no, he may have been talking about downy mildew.
Yeah.
Oh, downy mildew. Okay. Sorry.
But the powders and
Other challenges? You guys have it worked out except for downy mildew and cucumber beetles, huh?
So everybody controls striped cucumber beetle, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, striped cucumber beetle.
You have them?
We'd like to test this
You
I'll get right on it.
So I am going to really push for growers to sort of put forward ideas here, because again, you have a room full of researchers that are interested in hearing what would be your priorities for work. Yeah.
Well, what he said, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
What he said last year, that he had a lot of, my winter squash, my summer squash, everything had a lot of like all different kinds of mildews and molds that I've never seen before on the bottom of my pumpkins. And I mean, I was just assuming it's this 100-year flat rain, but all this rain, I mean, I'm hoping that was the issue last year because I've never seen,
Did you have anything diagnosed?
no, I didn't. But I mean, we're up high. We normally, our soil drains well, but not this year. We had a lot of water in our
Fruit rots?
yeah, lots of rots. I saw a lot of powdery, lots of different kinds of mildews, lots of different kinds of rots in my winter squash, especially that I've never seen. So,
Especially
I'm hoping.
we just have a minute or so. So other ideas from growers that they want to put forward, or folks we haven't heard from yet? Nope. Go ahead.
Well, we got vine boards for the first time this year, and I'm hoping that doesn't happen again, but I really dislike them. Open to any ideas.
We got vine boards in a field that hasn't had cucurbits on it in 20 years. And I hadn't had them since I had a home garden as a kid, and then they would just destroy our cucurbits every year. We learned what they were, and then, since I've been involved in farm, butternuts were fine. Only thing, we lost early and late plantings of all of our zucchinis and summer squash, and then they got into the winter, we tore that stuff out and burned it. First time I saw it, and because of having been a kid and having them kill the garden every year, I feel like I looked for that, even though I've never seen it agriculturally. We tore all those plants out and burned them, and then they got into the winter squash, and they decimated everything but the butternut.
I did a trial on squash vine borer this year and found that a BT product called Agree worked well against it, and Trust worked fairly well against it. And the timing is about 1,000 base 50-degree days you want to start, and I put 3 weekly applications on. That coincides, that degree day coincides when chicory starts to flower. So I'm going to write an article about that for the NOFA newsletter. And there's a special label that you have to use these 2 products, because squash vine borer doesn't appear on the label. So I'll include information about that too.
And you are soaking the base of the plants in the spray?
I actually just put it over with a boom spray. I didn't really concentrate. It was a boom spray, a handheld boom sprayer. So I wasn't like squirting it around the base. So that even that worked fairly well.
And you're targeting the moths? or the
I'm
butter-
targeting the eggs
the eggs.
as they
At the
hatch
base.
before they tunnel in.
Well, we're at our time, it's 4 o'clock, we have a 15-minute break before our next session, so I'd like to just again thank our speakers,